Just 5 days after the largest surrender of the American Civil War, a defeated government supposedly executed a devastating decapitation strike. The Army of Northern Virginia had already laid down its weapons at Appomattox, rendering conventional military victory mathematically impossible. How could a shattered republic, devoid of infrastructure and running on fumes, orchestrate the simultaneous assassination of the highest officials in Washington? Today, we step into the untold shadows of the Confederate Secret Service and the true architects of April 14, 1865. Washington, D.C. in April 1865 was a fortress city, ringed by dozens of heavy artillery forts and garrisoned by thousands of veteran Union soldiers. It was the most heavily defended capital on the planet. Yet the defense seemed impenetrable only on paper. The internal security protocols were alarmingly porous. The president frequently walked or rode through the muddy streets with minimal military escort. This systemic vulnerability was well known to Confederate intelligence gathering networks operating within the city. The paradox of ultimate military victory, paired with absolute domestic vulnerability, set the stage for disaster. The smoke hung low inside Ford's Theater. A single shot from a .44 caliber Derringer fractured the fragile peace of an exhausted nation. The president slumped forward. Chaos erupted instantly. John Wilkes Booth leapt to the stage, brandished a heavy blade, and fled into the damp Washington night. This was not an act of random violence. It was a highly calculated strike. Confirm receipt with a like to support our next historical decryption, and subscribe to join our analysis network. For over a century, accepted history has framed Booth as a rogue actor. He is painted as a fanatic driven by ideological fury and misplaced Southern nationalism. The evidence, however, points toward a far more sophisticated intelligence operation. The killer did not act in a vacuum.
And the payment?
The textbook narrative presents a convenient, compartmentalized tragedy. Booth, a famous and temperamental celebrity, gathered a pathetic band of misfits in a local boarding house. Together, they plotted to kidnap the commander-in-chief. When the kidnapping logistics failed, their plan mutated into a desperate, improvised murder plot. This official version is comforting in its simplicity. It isolates the crime. It protects the delicate post-war reunification process from the horrors of organized state terrorism. But a closer examination of the operational logistics reveals glaring contradictions. Booth was navigating an established underground rat line through southern Maryland. This precise route was heavily utilized by Confederate couriers. Safe houses were pre-stocked with weapons, field glasses, and fresh horses. A rogue actor does not accidentally access a highly classified military intelligence network. Mary Surratt's boarding house was not merely a random meeting place for malcontents. It functioned as a critical intelligence node within the Capitol itself. Her son, John Surratt, was an active and highly effective Confederate courier.
It will be.
He constantly traversed the dangerous lines between Richmond, Washington, and the operational hub in Montreal. Surratt possessed the clearance and the skill to move sensitive messages past Union pickets. When Booth integrated himself into this specific boarding house, he was plugging his operation directly into an active military framework. Furthermore, the selection of the conspirators was highly specialized.
I am ready.
David Harold was an expert outdoorsman who knew the escape routes intimately. These were not random choices. They were tactical acquisitions. The financial trails are even more problematic. In late 1864, Booth traveled to Montreal, a known operational hub for Confederate Secret Service agents. He deposited substantial funds in the Ontario Bank. This was the very same financial institution used by Jacob Thompson, the primary Confederate emissary in Canada. Thompson commanded a massive secret budget authorized directly by officials in Richmond. Information asymmetry was the true weapon of this shadow war. Who knew about Booth's intentions, and when did they authorize them? The lines between independent radical and state-sponsored operative blur completely upon analyzing the Canadian connection. The official story relies on a tragic coincidence. Military logic suggests a deliberate, funded mechanism. We must follow the gold. To understand the assassination, we must analyze the geopolitical desperation of the Confederacy in late 1864. The conventional war was definitively lost. Union armies under Ulysses S. Grant were slowly strangling Richmond in a brutal siege. William Tecumseh Sherman was carving a path of logistical annihilation through Georgia. Physical battlefield victories were no longer achievable. The Confederate leadership required a radical shift in strategy. Asymmetric warfare became their final, desperate gamble. Jefferson Davis authorized a shadow campaign to break Northern morale from the inside. He deployed his most ruthless operatives to Canada to launch terror operations across the border. The St. Albans raid of October 1864 demonstrated the sheer audacity of this new shadow war. Confederate operatives crossed from Canada into Vermont, robbed 3 banks, and terrorized the civilian population before escaping. This psychological strike proved that the Union interior was no longer safe from the physical consequences of the conflict. The political fallout was massive. Union commanders were forced to divert critical manpower to guard the northern border, relieving pressure on the southern fronts. This was the exact Machiavellian logic that drove the assassination plot. By creating chaos and fear deep behind enemy lines, the Confederacy hoped to shatter the political will of the Northern electorate. They planned to burn New York City to the ground. They attempted to liberate thousands of prisoners of war from Camp Douglas in Chicago. They even designed explosive coal torpedoes to detonate inside the boilers of Union steamboats. Every moral boundary had been eroded by 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Psychological pressure replaced traditional artillery. The goal was no longer to win battles. The objective was to make the cost of continuing the war psychologically unbearable for the Northern public. Do you believe asymmetric terror can ever win a war that conventional armies have lost? This toxic environment of state-sponsored sabotage incubated the plot against the federal government. Jacob Thompson and Clement Clay orchestrated this clandestine network from their Montreal headquarters. They possessed a war chest of over $1 million in gold. They utilized this immense leverage to fund saboteurs, blockade runners, and political agitators. Booth's arrival in Montreal in October 1864 aligns perfectly with a shift in Confederate targeting strategy.
The gold is here.
He met with known intelligence operatives.
We understand the terms. The time is near.
He drank with blockade runners and Confederate sympathizers at the St. Lawrence Hall.
For the cause.
Following this trip, his actions transformed from idle boasting into methodical, heavily funded planning. He began recruiting hardened action men. He purchased Spencer repeating carbines, revolvers, and combat knives. He arranged for the transfer of a highly valuable horse to Washington.
The gold.
None of this was cheap, and none of it was improvised.
The horse is ready.
He was operating with the distinct logistical footprint of a state-backed intelligence asset. The Confederate government had already entertained proposals for kidnapping operations. A successful abduction could force the Union to resume prisoner exchanges. This exchange would inject thousands of veteran soldiers back into the depleted Southern ranks. The geopolitical leverage gained from holding Abraham Lincoln hostage would be absolute. Richmond would dictate the terms of peace. But as the military situation rapidly deteriorated, the kidnapping paradigm became strategically obsolete. A captive leader is only valuable if your government survives long enough to negotiate a treaty. By early April 1865, Richmond had fallen. The Confederate capital was reduced to smoking, blackened ash. The psychological stress on the operatives in the field reached an absolute breaking point. The original mission profile collapsed. Assassination remained the only viable protocol. The transition from capture to kill was not a random spark of madness. It was the brutal, calculating logic of a decapitation strike against a conquering power. The execution of the April 14th plot demonstrates a terrifying level of operational coordination. This was a multi-target strike designed to annihilate the entire executive branch of the United States simultaneously. Booth targeted the president. Lewis Powell, a hardened Confederate combat veteran, was dispatched to eliminate Secretary of State William Seward. George Atzerodt was assigned to murder Vice President Andrew Johnson. This level of synchronization requires intense planning, strict timeline management, and cold execution. Powell's assault on Seward's home was a masterclass in close-quarters kinetic violence. He bluffed his way past the front door under the guise of delivering medicine. Once inside, the illusion shattered entirely. His revolver misfired in the darkened hallway. He immediately transitioned to his blade, severely wounding 5 different men in a brutal, bloody melee. Powell operated with the cold, mechanical precision of a trained frontline shock trooper. Meanwhile, Booth utilized his intimate knowledge of Ford's theater to navigate the backstage shadows unseen. He knew the exact architectural layout. He knew the comedic pacing of the play being performed on stage. He timed his fatal shot to coincide perfectly with the loudest line of dialogue. The weapon itself dictated his tactical approach. A Philadelphia Derringer is a single-shot weapon that requires extreme physical proximity to guarantee lethality. Booth had to achieve point-blank range. He bypassed the Presidential Guard, exploiting a fatal lapse in security that still haunts American history. The physical friction of the moment was immense. He barricaded the outer door of the box with a wooden plank, engineering a physical choke point. This prevented immediate reinforcement from the hallway. It was a micro-siege within a single theater box. When Booth fired the fatal shot, the kinetic energy of the heavy lead ball shattered the president's skull. Major Henry Rathbone attempted to grapple with the assassin. Booth slashed his arm to the bone with a heavy combat knife. The assassin then vaulted over the balcony railing. His spur caught on a draped flag, altering his trajectory and snapping his fibula as he landed on the wooden stage below. Despite this agonizing injury, the adrenaline of the strike propelled him forward. He limped out the back door, mounted his waiting horse, and vanished. The speed of his egress was mechanically perfect. He had staged the horse in the rear alley precisely for this reason. By the time the stunned audience fully comprehended the horror, Booth was already galloping toward the Navy Yard Bridge. The laughter of the audience had masked the deafening roar of the percussion cap. The trap sprang shut flawlessly. Information asymmetry paralyzed the Union leadership in the immediate, chaotic aftermath. Telegraph lines running directly out of Washington suddenly went dead. This isolated the capital during the critical first hours of the desperate manhunt. The evidence strongly suggests a coordinated effort by unknown actors to delay pursuit. Booth escaped across the Navy Yard Bridge with alarming, suspicious ease. The sentry at the bridge, operating under confusing standing orders, allowed him to pass into Maryland just before midnight. He plunged directly into the Confederate Secret Service rat line. He met with Thomas Jones, a veteran Confederate agent who controlled the Potomac River crossings. Jones kept Booth hidden in a dense pine thicket for nearly a week. He provided food, local newspapers, and the exact logistical intelligence required to safely cross the river. The rogue actor narrative completely crumbles in the dismal swamps of Maryland. Booth was entirely reliant on a state-funded underground network to survive the perimeter dragnet. Without Confederate logistical support, he would have been captured within 24 hours. The federal investigation into the assassination was swift, sweeping, and utterly ruthless. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton launched the largest military manhunt in American history. He possessed a deep, driving paranoia regarding Confederate government involvement. Stanton immediately sought to link Jefferson Davis directly to the sprawling murder plot. Military tribunals were quickly convened. Stanton's military tribunals operated with ruthless efficiency, denying the accused the standard protections of a civilian court. He needed swift executions to pacify a terrified and enraged public. The hanging of Mary Surratt demonstrated the uncompromising brutality of the state's response. The primary conspirators were rapidly tried, convicted, and hanged in the summer heat. However, the deeper intelligence connections were ultimately buried by time and political expediency. Proving direct written orders from Richmond proved to be legally and politically impossible. The Confederate Secret Service had operated with excellent compartmentalization throughout the war. Incriminating documents were burned. Key spies vanished into the chaotic, untraceable post-war diaspora. Jacob Thompson fled to Europe, taking the secrets of the Montreal spy ring to his grave. The deep state architecture that enabled John Wilkes Booth evaporated into the mists of history. It left behind only fragmented financial ledgers and whispered rumors. The American public desperately needed closure, not a sprawling, unsolvable conspiracy involving foreign safe havens. Thus, the lone fanatic theory was solidified into the national historical record. Yet the tactical reality remains clear to those who study the harsh mechanics of asymmetric warfare. The strikes of April 14th were the dying, violent spasms of a desperate, cornered nation. A government pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation will utilize every weapon in its hidden arsenal. The line between military intelligence and state terror is always the first casualty of total defeat. Which historical intelligence operation should we analyze in the next episode?